The thing I love about Gregg Braden is he's got this incredible energy, this calmness, this peacefulness to him. He's actually a musician, and that makes sense. And he's here to tell us that in order to survive in all the chaos that's around us, we must think differently and act differently. And he's actually got this fascinating theory about 3 different cycles of human development. One is an economic cycle, one is a cycle of violence, and one is a cycle of climate change. And they're all converging right now. And Gregg has some really interesting ideas about how we can really be different people as we go through this change. He also has some ideas about human evolution and also the intelligence of the heart muscle. So I really think you're going to enjoy Gregg. Again, I really enjoyed just being around him. He had this incredible energy that I know you will enjoy too.
Brian, I am thrilled to be here. I am so excited to have this conversation today. I have no idea where we're going to go, and I know it's going to be good wherever we go.
Good, I'm pumped as well. That's the best way to start these things. First of all, how is London treating you? What is it like when you land here? What's the energy of the city like?
I have to tell you, when I get my schedules and I see where I'm going to be, I get an Excel spreadsheet that has the city and what I'm going to be doing. And when I go down and I see London, I always get a big smile on my face and a good feeling in my heart. I love this city. I love the people of this city. You know, it's hard to put my finger on exactly why. There's a vibe. It just feels good to be here. I think a lot of your viewers know that when I'm not doing what I'm doing now, I'm also a musician, and London is a very happening music scene. But it's also a hub for consciousness, and people are willing to converge in this city from all points of the earth. They will come here from Brazil and Argentina and Chile and Kuwait and Dubai and Beijing for the programs that we do here, because I think they feel what I feel when they come here, and it feels like coming home. It's a good feeling.
Yeah, for me, it's like a real melting pot. You know, you'll hear all different kinds of languages. People will wear whatever they want, and it's just kind of this hub for a lot of, you know, Europe and parts of the world. And you know, I'm here for a reason. I quite like it. But it's always interesting to hear what Americans think in the vibe. You know, you mentioned music. How does that play in who you are? You know, the whole music side of it, because we know you mostly for your work and your books. Sure. How does that play into how you learn, how you communicate, how you feel things?
I'm a composer, singer, songwriter, guitar, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, folk, rock, blues, everything. And it uses a different part of the brain. Actually, in my office, I have a very complex office. I have the working office space. I have the yoga, martial arts, exercise space, and I have a music studio all in one area. Typically, it's all in one area. And what I find myself doing is when I'll be writing, you know, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, researching a book or something, there's a point where I will get up and pick up that guitar, and it just shifts to a completely different part of the brain just for a moment. And in that moment, there's a freedom that comes, and an openness and an emptiness. And in that emptiness, I can be full. In the emptiness of letting go of ideas and thoughts, I can be full for whatever is present for me, and go back and begin writing again. So the music has continued to this day to be a very powerful, I don't want to call it just a factor. It's a force, a very powerful force in my life.
And do you find the same with physical movement as well? When you go over
Absolutely.
And engage with that, your brain goes into maybe another space?
If you've ever seen me in presentation mode, you've never seen me sitting on a stage. I'm always standing, I'm always in motion, because it is the motion that moves the energy. And I had someone ask me in an interview recently, Gregg, how do you remember everything that you remember when you're on the stage? And I said, I was surprised at the question, first of all. And I said, I couldn't possibly remember everything. I have no idea. I know what the slides in a presentation will look like. I have no idea what I'm going to say. And that's why every presentation is different, because it is being present in the moment with the people and the hearts and the minds and the souls in that room. And my mantra, literally, as I walk from backstage out onto a stage, my mantra to the universe is, I become empty so I can become full. In my emptiness, I'm present for whatever is needed in that moment. And that's where the magic happens. And the same thing happens with music.
And when you move, martial arts and yoga,
yes,
you probably go to another space, or?
It's always been, it's the integration of mind and body and spirit together. Martial arts, not for the purpose of necessarily of self-defense, but it's the purpose of the discipline. I've always been drawn to the discipline of yogic traditions. I've spent much of my adult life researching in some of the most remote and isolated and beautiful and magnificent and mystical places remaining on the earth today. Most of them are high elevation, high altitude. And I love high elevation. I live in high elevation. And in those cultures, every one of those cultures are things they all share. They all share, you and I have talked about this, they all have tea of some kind, and I love and collect tea. They all have music. And typically it's a wind instrument. I collect the flutes I have I've got a huge flute collection from every culture that I've ever been to, and they all have a form of movement. So I have adapted for my personal use. It's an amalgam of different kinds of movements. People will say, you know, what practice do you do? And it doesn't have a name per se, because it is an amalgam of what I've learned from the people in Tibet and the people in the Andes and native traditions and in the desert Southwest. But the movement, to me, it's key to honor. And that's the word that comes to me every time that I do this, to honor the presence of the soul in the physical body and that integration. And without that movement, I think that's where the stagnation begins.
Yeah, well, you're obviously doing something right, because you look great. Greg.
Well, I've been traveling. I'm a little jet lagged today, so thank you.
Well, you wouldn't know, but you know, human movement is something we talk a lot about on the show, and there's a great mover named Ido Portal who you know, gets people to move. I try to move every single day now, and again, I do feel like it's an honor. I kind of have to honor my own body and make sure that I go through those paces and do these things that sometimes start to be uncomfortable, and sometimes later they become more comfortable. And martial arts is also something that I've been fascinated with most of my life. You know, as a young man, sometimes you go in thinking, I'm going to learn how to beat someone up, and then you realize, actually, I'm learning about humility and respect and learning about all these other things that the martial arts bring. And
yeah, for me, the martial arts was my introduction to meditation. Okay. Something happened to me on my 21st birthday. I was living in northern Missouri. I woke up the morning of my 21st birthday. I remember it very clearly. Something clicked, something changed within me. And on that day, I became a distance runner. On that day, I literally went that day and registered and enrolled in my first martial arts class, and it was self-defense. It was a karate class being taught by a Special Forces vet from, at that time, the Vietnam era, that was all about, it was about warfare. And on Mondays and Wednesdays, Tuesdays and Thursdays, I enrolled in another class of judo, which was all about playing. My instructor would say, do you want to play judo? It's just a completely different mindset. But I remember my first day, it was Bushido-kan, karate. And then my first day in the dojo, he said, okay, we will do a meditation on the mat before we begin. So all the students, we kneeled on the mat for about 3 minutes. And he introduced a meditative technique, and he says, okay, let's begin. And I said, well, wait a minute. Can we just stay in the meditation for a little bit longer, because something very beautiful was happening there?
Right.
And he
and
said,
back then, that must have been very novel.
It was, and he looked at me and he said, in a little bit of a condescending way, he said, son, if the meditation is what you're drawn to, you're in the wrong class. But that was my first experience of meditation, and it was 1980s. I began studying yoga with a Sikh mystic in Denver, Colorado, and it was still considered at that time, in the 1980s, the Cold War era, it was considered a cult. And I remember there was a coworker who would go to the classes with me who could not tell his wife and family what it was he was doing because of the stigma that was attached to yoga during that time. But
yeah, people forget kind of what it was like back then, pre-internet, you know, where a lot of ways you hear about this as a book being passed around or going here and going there. A lot of weird fears around that kind of thing.
Brian, you think of the world that we live in now and how far we've come from the world we were in, the change that's accelerated in just a few decades. I mean, it is truly mind-boggling when you, not only the technology, again, as a musician, you know, we've gone from very thick vinyl to 8-track tapes and cassette tapes and CDs, and now we're digital, and I think from here we go quantum. I think quantum music is probably where we're going next. It's what they're working with, quantum encryption. I think the music will be the same. It's happened in a single lifetime.
Yeah, I know, it's incredible.
I'm a degreed geologist, and I worked as a geologist during the first energy crisis of the 1970s. And when the oil industry changed, I was in Denver, Colorado, and I didn't want to leave Denver. So I applied for an aerospace position because I wanted to study, I wanted the science. I wanted to study the stars and human potential in space. And I was hired by an aerospace company And they said, okay, you have a job. And we will give you an unclassified position for 6 months while you go through a background check for security. And then you'll have your job. So we did that. 6 months later, I got my security clearance, and they said, well, this is the Cold War. We need you on the security defense side of the house. And I began working on the defense side under something called Star Wars Initiative.
Where was that? In Los Angeles?
During the Cold War years. Star Wars this is where, it was an insane time. Yeah. It was an insane time. This was the very futuristic technology that was being deployed in space at the time. Lasers and mirrors, bouncing lasers off of one another and things like that. But I have to say, it was hard for me. I went through a lot of nights, sleepless nights, like, why me? Why am I in this position?
Why? Because you weren't comfortable being part of this? Because
I've always had such an aversion to war, and the great wars of the past have triggered something within me, and I have a sense of what that's about, another conversation, but the idea of using the technology to take the lives of civilians on such a massive scale. And as I was working, I was a software developer for launch pad technology for missiles during the Cold War by day. And at night, I've always been drawn to the wisdom of the past. I was researching our most ancient and cherished texts and spiritual traditions, believing, as I believe today, that if we know where to look and how to look in the past, Brian, our ancestors left us the wisdom and the clues to change the way we think, so that we would never find ourselves in the kind of wars that we found ourselves in the 20th century. I mean, World War II, 60 million lives. I don't even know what that number looks like. Were lost. We came so close during the Cold War era to doing the unthinkable and unleashing nuclear weapons on civilian populations. And we had arsenals that are just ridiculous enough to microwave the planet many times over. Why would we ever allow ourselves to go to that place? And how can we avoid doing that again? And my feeling was that if we know where to look and how to look, we could do that. And all of the wisdom of the past pointed to the same thing. It says the better we know ourselves, the less we fear change in the world, the less we fear one another, and the less we fear our own power. And as we embrace our own power, we feel less need to exude that power externally in terms of the kinds of things that we've seen in the past. So that was a very powerful, a pivotal moment in my life, the Cold War years, to hone. Not only is the past interesting, but I think it's vital. There's a continuity of knowledge and wisdom, and we are part of that continuity. And what the new discoveries are showing is that history is cyclic, it's not linear. And we are most definitely in a cycle, repeating a cycle from the past. And the question is, are we going to make the same mistakes today that we've made in the past with the advanced technology that we have? And we're, you, me, our audience, our nations, we're deciding to answer that question right now.
And it's up to us. And again, the individual change can actually change that future outcome.
It doesn't take many people to actually change, and especially with the internet, with digital communications, very few people introducing ideas, new ideas. There's an openness now that I have never seen in my lifetime to embrace new ideas. When it appears that everything is set in stone, it looks like everything's all buttoned up and locked down, it's very hard to introduce new ideas. When the world is in chaos, which is what we're experiencing right now, people are primed, they are ripe for new ideas, and it's very easy for a single idea, if it is well thought out, if it is honest, truthful, factual. In my case as a scientist, if it's based on scientific principles, not just theory or hypothesis, but real science, there is a willingness to embrace those ideas. And that's what myself, my dear friends, colleagues, spiritual brothers, people like Joe Dispenza, Dr. Bruce Lipton, many others, in our own ways, we found that openness is here, and we've dedicated our lives to sharing what we have come to know with the people who are open to listening to it. And we're also very honest. What we have come to know is changing, because science is designed to be constantly updated. It's not a static knowledge system. So what I'm saying today will be even a little different from the book that I published last year, because we now know more than we knew when that book was published last year. I think it's really important to be honest and truthful and factual when we're sharing this information. But all of it tells us, number one, we're not what we've been told. Number two, we're more than we've ever imagined. And number three, that we have, as individuals and collectively, a potential that is so grossly untapped. We have a potential within us. And as we embrace that potential, we begin to think of ourselves very differently and see the world very differently. And to me, this is where the end of hate begins.
You know, we're actually on a project. We've made about 4 documentary films so far at London Reel, and our next project is called Dissolution: Beyond the Ego, and we're trying to look at what's happening in the world right now, and this rise in tribalism and maybe the abuse of the environment, and trying to think, you know, how can we get to terms with our own ego and try to find out if there's a way where we don't have to have, like you said, this repetitive cycle of this destruction, and start trying to introduce some new ideas by people like you and the other gentleman you mentioned, and anywhere else, to try to find out, you know, what we can do to kind of course correct us.
Can I speak to that
just
a little bit? This is where my training, you know, I believe there are no accidents. It's no accident that I began as an earth scientist earth science is about huge cycles of time. It's not about right now, it's about, you know, huge natural cycles that tell us where we fit right now into those big cycles. It's no accident, I think, that I ended up working in the corporations, because it taught me how people think when they are in fear, how they think in terms of, and in times of war. It taught me about how to train. Part of my job was training Air Force cadets on software, and some of them didn't want to learn the software. And so I learned about interfacing with people, and all of those principles I use in the work that I'm doing right now.
Steve Jobs says, connect the dots in reverse, right?
Yeah, I believe that. So when I began looking in 1970s, I was looking at geologically at the cycles of the Earth, and at that time there was a concerted effort to keep the scientific boundaries in place. So if you study chemistry, it's in a box. You study archaeology, it's in a box. Geology, anthropology, it's in a box. And I said, you know, nature doesn't work that way. We've got to cross those traditional boundaries, because there's a story, and the story is what we're living. So as a geologist, what I could see is that we are living this rare convergence of 3 massive cycles of change that very few people are talking about in the mainstream media. Bruce Lipton and I shared it at the United Nations. You mentioned that in the intro. Any one of these 3 cycles would be enough to turn the world upside down on end. And the fact that all 3 are converging right now tells us why the change is happening, why there's an openness for new ideas. The 3 cycles, one we are very aware of is climate. And if only climate were happening, climate change, that'd be enough to change the way we think, the way we grow our food, the way we share resources, the way we interact with one another. There's an economic cycle, 67-year economic cycle that is completing, and by definition, a new one is beginning. And if we don't know that, if we're still thinking about economies, and this isn't only about money, it's about people and the way people work together, share information, and share resources. That's part of the economy. If we are still thinking the way we're thinking 10 or 15 years ago, that's where the struggle and the suffering comes from. The 3rd cycle is fascinating to me, and the United Nations had never heard of this cycle, and I was amazed because I would think that they would. It is a cycle of human conflict. And they said, what do you mean? Doesn't it just happen when it happens? And I said, well, actually, what the science shows is that human conflict ebbs and flows following the rhythms of magnetic fields between the sun and the earth and the human heart. Now, this is where it gets into what's called forbidden territory for science. The human heart is the strongest magnetic field in the human body. It's about 5,000 times stronger than the brain. And what we know, the science is showing us very clearly, peer-reviewed science, is that when the magnetic fields of the earth are strong, we are more cooperative and much less aggressive. And the reverse is true when the magnetic fields are weak. And we are now in a weakening cycle. So it doesn't mean that we must have conflict. It means that we are vulnerable and susceptible. And if you look at the charts, the ebbs and the flows of the great wars in the past, when they begin and when they end, they also end when these cycles, at the peaks and the valleys of these cycles. It means we are now living the greatest opportunity for peace because of our vulnerability, if we have the wisdom to recognize that and not succumb to the forces and the impetus for conflict. So the fact that all three of these are converging right now, that tells us, people say, what's going on? This is what's going on. What do we do about it? You can't stop the cycles, but we definitely have the ability to determine how we respond to those cycles. And that's what myself, my colleagues what we're sharing is how we have the opportunity to awaken our inner power, because we are self-referencing beings. So what I mean by that is we are taught to determine our well-being based on the physical, the external world. When the world out here is okay, we feel pretty good. When that world begins to change, if we don't know who we are, that change can be frightening. So right now, we are globalizing the planet. We're mushing together cultures, religions, people, ways of men thinking about women and women thinking about men. We're pushing ourselves together on the one hand, but we're asking ourselves to embrace that change through a thinking that's obsolete. On the other hand, the better we know ourselves, the less we fear strange cultures to us, the less we fear the unknown. The better we know ourselves, the less we fear our own power. And as we embrace our inner power, we're much more comfortable with the external change because we're no longer threatened. So this is what our ancient traditions have told us. The geology helped me to see the natural rhythms that are playing out on the big scale. And the new science, biology, the new science, neurology has helped me to see what that means in our personal lives individually. And so I've done my best to bring those together to a story, and that's what I'm sharing.
What's the reaction of like the United Nations and some other people when you try to explain these cycles and the magnetic pieces? And do they know what to do with it?
Well, when we're in those conferences or those situations, I've learned to use different language at different times. I'm sharing with you and our viewers a lay language I'm very comfortable with. But I'm also talking about some terms that may not be familiar. When we're at those conferences, we have images, illustrations, and very simple language that we're using. And it was interesting because when you talk about the United Nations, there is no the UN. There are UNs within the UN. It's like a corporation, departments within departments. There's an old guard that has a very structured way of thinking, and there is a new element that is coming in that is very willing to embrace new ideas, and they're doing this. So something very interesting happened. Can I share with you what happened at the UN? So Bruce Lipton and I were co-presenting, me as an earth scientist, he as a life scientist. He's a biologist, I'm a geologist. And so it works very well together. And while we were presenting in the back of the room, the door opened after the presentation began, and some people came and they shuffled in, and they didn't sit down, they were all standing up along the back wall. And it was a little unnerving, as a speaker. I thought, who are these people? And then they all left. And we thought, what was that all about? We discovered later that the UN Secretary General had sent a small delegation to check us out. They wanted to see what we were saying, what we were talking about. And what they took back to him was that they felt it was something that everyone should see. So they turned on the CCTV, the closed circuit television in the UN complex, and anyone that wanted to watch us in that presentation could. Now, we did not know that at the time. It's probably good we didn't know that at the time, because I would have changed my language to speak to a broader audience. But it told me that there is a willingness. It's such a different way of thinking, Brian. When I was in school in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, I was taught what is called the standard model. It's a standard model of history, the standard model of human origins and evolution, the standard model of history in terms of linear progression from less sophisticated to more sophisticated. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's not that I don't believe it. The evidence no longer supports it. Okay. I want to be really clear. The evidence, it's not just about belief. It's about being honest with ourselves. We've asked science to tell us who we are, and science is doing a really good job. And the question is, are we willing to embrace the story that science is telling us?